All right, welcome to your deep dive. This time we're going way back in time to look at something really interesting, something that's kind of hidden. The connections between colonialism and homosexuality. We've got some amazing sources for you, mostly from this book called Colonialism and Homosexuality. It's got all kinds of stuff. Archival documents, court records, personal letters, even art.
Wow.
So our mission today is to uncover this history of homosexuality within the context of European colonialism. We're going to talk about the experiences of individuals, how society viewed things, and even how this all showed up in art.
Yeah, it really is fascinating how these two forces, colonialism and homosexuality, are so intertwined. I mean, people often see them as separate, but when you really look at the sources, the connections are surprising, to say the least.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to think about these early European explorers going to all these new places, meeting all these different cultures. I mean, can you imagine what a shock it must have been to see different views on sexuality, views that were so different from their own?
Oh, absolutely. And the way they documented these encounters is really telling. Some, of course, reacted with disgust, but others, they were curious. And it's in their writings that we can kind of get a glimpse of how people understood sexuality back then. Like Richard Burton, for example.
Oh, yeah, Burton. I mean, his sotatic zone theory, that was back in the 1880s, right? He actually proposed that there was like a whole geographical area where homosexuality was more common. Man, that must have been controversial.
Oh, it definitely was. His theory basically argued that homosexuality was more prevalent in this zone that stretched from North Africa all the way through the Middle East and into Asia.
Wow.
And while it did acknowledge that culture and environment could influence sexuality, it also kind of reflected the anxieties and biases of that time. It basically categorized this whole region based on how Europeans viewed sexuality, and that just pushed these cultures even further into the other category.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how easy it is to, look at the past through our own modern lens.
Absolutely, and it shows how important it is to really analyze these historical sources with a critical eye.
For sure. Now, another explorer that comes to mind is Henry Morton Stanley, the one who went all over Africa. I remember reading about his close relationship with Kalulu, a young African boy he brought back to Europe with him.
Yeah, that's a relationship that raises a lot of questions about power dynamics, about the complexities of these relationships between cultures during colonialism. It makes you think about the ethics of those interactions and how the whole context of colonialism shaped them.
It's a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems.
Definitely not. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about military life and colonial administration. Think about it. Rigid environments, far from home. In a way, it created unique opportunities for same-sex relationships to develop, relationships that were often hidden from the public.
It's almost like a paradox, right? These really structured conservative environments also providing space for these hidden relationships.
Exactly. A good example is Marshal Lyautey of France, a big figure in Morocco in the early 1900s. He was known to prefer the company of young soldiers, even openly admiring their youthful energy.
Wow, that really challenges our assumptions about how sexuality was perceived and experienced back then. And it wasn't just him, right? Didn't T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, have similar experiences?
He did. His time in the Middle East involved some homoerotic encounters, and he formed deep emotional bonds with Arab men. But of course, this hidden world had a price. Living with the constant fear of exposure, which could mean social ruin and even legal trouble.
Yeah, I can't imagine the courage it took to navigate that world. And then there are the tragic cases, like Sir Hector MacDonald. Right?
Yes, MacDonald. He was a British war hero, but he ended up committing suicide because of accusations of homosexuality while he was stationed in Ceylon. It's a really sad reminder of how society pressured people and the legal dangers people faced just for being themselves.
Absolutely heartbreaking. Now let's talk about art and colonialism. This is where things get really interesting. We see how these colonial experiences influenced art, music, and literature in Europe, especially through what's called Orientalism.
Orientalism.
Yeah, that's the romanticized, sometimes even eroticized way of depicting Eastern cultures. It's almost like a window into these hidden desires and experiences. So tell us, how did all of this play out in art?
Well, let's take the French painter, Etienne Dine, for example. He converted to Islam and actually developed a close relationship with his Algerian model, Slimane Ben Ibrahim. This personal connection, it really goes against the grain of the typical colonial narrative.
Yeah, it shows you that personal connections can really challenge those broader cultural narratives. But I wonder, even with this genuine connection, did his art still end up portraying Algerian culture in an exotic way, like through a European lens,
That's a really insightful observation, and it really highlights how complex Orientalism is. On the one hand, it challenged European norms by showing same-sex desire. But on the other hand, it often did that by portraying non-European cultures in this romanticized and sometimes, even fetishizing way. It reinforced that idea of the exotic other.
So it's like a double-edged sword, both challenging and reinforcing the existing power dynamic.
Exactly. And De Net wasn't alone. There were photographers like Leonard and Landrock and Baron Wilhelm von Gloden. They captured all these images of male beauty in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Their work really reflects this growing fascination with the exotic male body, often seen through that romanticized and, sometimes problematic lens.
It's like they were speaking in this coded language, using art to express desires and experiences that they couldn't talk about openly.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And speaking of coded language, literature also played a huge role in exploring this whole thing, the complexities of homosexuality in a colonial context. Authors like André Gide and G.F. Green, they used their words to give a voice to these experiences.
I'm really interested in hearing more about their work. Gide's novel, Le Moraliste, set in North Africa, that one comes to mind. I've heard it pushed a lot of boundaries with its exploration of sexual awakening and liberation.
Oh, it did. Le Moraliste is a powerful story, really. It's about challenging those conventional European morals and exploring personal liberation, all within this colonial setting. And it caused quite a stir because of its frank depiction of same-sex desire.
It's incredible how these writers could use fiction to address real-world issues and explore what it meant to live under these societal norms.
Totally. And then there's G.F. Green. He lived in colonial Ceylon and wrote these really moving stories about homosexual relationships, often with tragic endings. His works show us how complex these experiences were and the social consequences that came with them in a society where these relationships were basically taboo.
It sounds like both Gide and Green were giving voice to experiences that were often silenced or pushed aside. Their work must have meant a lot to people who were caught between what society expected of them and their own desires.
You're absolutely right. Their stories give us a look into the lives of people struggling with their identities and navigating a really complex social landscape. And that brings us to a crucial part of this whole thing, the post-colonial reflections.
Yeah, I'm really eager to hear more about that, especially how this historical intersection is still shaping how we understand sexuality, power, and cultural identity today.
Absolutely. One figure who really embodies this complex legacy is Jean Genet. He was a French writer and a strong supporter of anti-colonial movements. But at the same time, he saw beauty and eroticism in the figures of revolutionaries, particularly the Palestinian Fedayeen.
That's fascinating. It sounds like his personal experiences and political views were really intertwined in a way that's hard to define.
He definitely challenged the way people thought. Genet's life and work show us just how impactful colonial experiences can be and how they can shape a person's identity and political beliefs in ways you wouldn't expect.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about facts and figures. It's about the lived experiences of people and how those experiences continue to shape our world.
Exactly. And I think one of the most challenging questions we face is this. If that Orientalist view of colonial homosexuality often romanticized and sometimes even fetishized non-European cultures, how can we learn from this history in a way that's both honest and respectful?
That's a really profound question. It challenges us to be both critical and empathetic as we explore the past.
Exactly. It's a reminder that this history is anything but simple. It's a tapestry of individual lives, cultural clashes, and this constant search for identity and connection.
A history that deserves our attention, not just as a subject to study, but as a way to reflect and understand our own time. It's incredible how these individual stories can tell us so much about the bigger picture, about the historical forces at play. We've been talking about explorers, military figures, artists. But what about the everyday experience? What about the social and legal context? How did different colonial societies view and treat homosexuality?
That's a really important question, and that's where all those archival documents, court records, personal writings, those really become important. They give us these little glimpses into how homosexuality was understood, tolerated, or punished in different colonial settings. It's amazing how varied the responses were.
Can you give us some specific examples? I mean, it must have been pretty complicated, right?
Absolutely. The book talks about this French military doctor, Dr. Jacobus X, stationed in Saigon in the late 1800s. He wrote about encountering male prostitution and same-sex practices among the locals. What's interesting is that he interpreted these practices through the lens of European theories about sexuality, connecting them to racial and cultural stereotypes.
So even as he was documenting these things, he was actually reinforcing that idea of a colonized other, pushing those he observed further to the margins.
Exactly. And it just shows how deeply rooted these biases were. His observations, while historically valuable, remind us to be critical of our sources, to recognize the biases that might be baked in.
It's true, history is always written from a specific point of view. And to make things even more complex, didn't the laws about homosexuality also vary across the different European empires?
They did. The laws regarding same-sex acts were all over the place. In some colonies, it was a serious crime, reflecting European norms. But in others, they kind of looked the other way, treating it as a private matter. Maybe that was tolerance, or maybe just a lack of enforcement. Hard to say.
So navigating this patchwork of laws and attitudes must have been a nightmare for anyone in a same-sex relationship. You could have relative freedom in one colony, only to face persecution in another.
Exactly. It was precarious, to say the least. They constantly had to judge the social and legal climate, weighing the risks of their actions. It must have been incredibly stressful.
I bet. This tension between personal desires and societal expectations, it must have led to some really tough situations. The book mentions some big scandals, right?
Oh, yeah, it does. One of the most famous cases involves Sir Roger Casement, the Irish diplomat and human rights activist. Really interesting figure, bravely exposed atrocities in the Congo and Peru, but his personal life ended up being his downfall.
Oh yeah, Casement. I remember learning about him. His work exposing colonial abuses was truly remarkable. But wasn't there a scandal involving his diaries or something?
There was. After they arrested him for treason during World War I, his diaries, which detailed his homosexual encounters, were made public. It really tarnished his reputation and overshadowed his humanitarian work.
Wow.
Now, whether it was a deliberate smear campaign or just an attempt to discredit him, that's up for debate, but it definitely played a role in his conviction.
It's tragic how personal lives could be used as weapons, especially back then when homosexuality was so taboo. His story really shows how risky it was to challenge the status quo, both politically and personally.
It does, and it raises questions about the connections between personal morality, public perception, and how sexuality was used to control people, especially those who challenged the colonial power structure.
It seems like this tension between what individuals wanted and what society expected keeps coming up, especially within the power dynamics of colonialism. It wasn't just about sexual orientation, it was about who got to decide what was acceptable and who was punished for breaking those rules.
You're absolutely right. And it's important to remember that while many were victims of their circumstances, they weren't just passive. They found ways to navigate this world, to find connections, to express themselves, and even to challenge the very systems that tried to control them.
So it's not just a story of oppression, but also a story of resilience, of agency, of that basic human need for connection and self-expression.
Exactly. And those stories of resistance, they're essential for understanding the full range of experiences within this historical intersection.
That makes me think back to our conversation about Orientalism, about how European art and literature often portrayed Eastern cultures through this, I guess, romanticized exotic lens. Didn't that also extend to how they depicted homosexuality?
It did. And these depictions, they could be fascinating, but also problematic. On the one hand, they challenged European norms by presenting same-sex relationships in non-European cultures as attractive, even liberating. But on the other hand, they could reinforce that image of the colonized other as exotic, mysterious, maybe even dangerous.
It's interesting how those seemingly positive portrayals could still contribute to negative stereotypes.
It is. It's a reminder to always think about the power dynamics at play, even in depictions that might seem harmless.
Did anyone from the colonized cultures ever respond to or challenge those Orientalist portrayals?
They did, and their responses were as diverse as the cultures themselves. Some saw it as cultural appropriation, a distortion of their traditions. Others embraced those portrayals, using them to challenge norms within their own communities. And others found ways to subvert those representations, taking back control of their own narratives and challenging the colonial perspective.
It sounds like a reflection of the broader struggle against colonial rule resistance, taking many forms, from outright rejection to adaptation and reinterpreting things.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even under colonial rule, agency and resistance were always there, even if they weren't always visible or celebrated.
These individual stories and artistic expressions offer such incredible insight into the bigger social and cultural shifts happening during this period. I'm curious, what about the lasting effects of this whole intersection of colonialism and homosexuality? Did it lead to any changes in attitudes or social structures?
It definitely did. And the legacies are complicated, both positive and negative. On one hand, exposure to diverse sexual practices and beliefs in colonial contexts challenged the rigid European norms and contributed to a growing awareness of sexual diversity.
So, in a way, it could be seen as a stepping stone towards the LGBTQ plus rights movements that came later?
You could say that,
I,
but it's important to acknowledge the downsides too. Associating homosexuality with colonized cultures, often presented as proof of their backwardness or degeneracy, really reinforced racist and homophobic attitudes, adding to the very prejudices that LGBTQ plus movements would later fight against.
it's like this double-edged sword, progress and prejudice all mixed up, each one shaping the other. Unraveling those influences and understanding the full scope of those legacies seems like a work in progress.
It is. Approaching history with nuance, recognizing both the progress and setbacks, the good and bad that shaped our current understanding of sexuality and its relationship to power, culture, colonialism is key.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how the past shapes our present and how we can learn from it to create a more just and equitable future.
Exactly. And I think one area that needs more exploration is how colonialism affected non-European societies' own understanding and acceptance of homosexuality.
You're talking about how colonialism might have sparked internal debates and changed attitudes within those societies themselves, right?
Mhm.
Not just how European norms were imposed, but how those encounters interacted with pre-existing beliefs and practices.
Yes, precisely. It's complex and sensitive, but crucial for understanding the whole picture. Remember, colonialism wasn't just about politics and economics. It was about culture and ideology, too.
So European ideas about sexuality, even about homosexuality, may have seeped into the fabric of those societies, mixing with their own traditional beliefs in ways that are hard to untangle.
Exactly. And it's a challenge for historians to try and separate those influences, to see what was already there and what might have changed because of colonialism. It requires careful study of the historical context, the specific colonial policies, and most importantly, the voices of those who lived through it.
It sounds like fascinating, albeit challenging, research. Are there any specific examples of this interplay between colonial influences and pre-existing beliefs about homosexuality in non-European societies?
Many examples, and they vary a lot depending on the region and the historical context. For instance, in some parts of Africa, pre-colonial societies had pretty tolerant views on same-sex relationships, often integrating them into their social structures and spiritual beliefs.
But then when the European colonizers came in with their moral codes, those practices were often criminalized and forced underground.
Unfortunately, yes. And that criminalization often went hand in hand with the spread of Christianity and its condemnation of homosexuality. A tragic example of how colonialism could disrupt and damage existing social norms, often leading to lasting prejudice.
But didn't some communities resist those imposed norms, finding ways to hold on to their traditions and beliefs?
Absolutely. Those acts of resistance are so important to recognize. Sometimes communities found subtle ways to keep their practices alive, adapting to the new reality. In other cases, they openly challenged those imposed norms, advocating for recognition and acceptance of their own traditions.
It shows that even under oppression, resilience and cultural preservation can find a way.
Exactly. Understanding those different forms of resistance is crucial for decolonizing our understanding of sexuality and recognizing the agency and resilience of non-European societies against colonial dominance. It challenges us to move beyond a simple narrative of victimhood and see the complexities of cultural exchange and resistance during this period.
It's a reminder that history is never simple, but rather a complex tapestry of interacting forces, individual choices, and cultural adaptations.
Absolutely. And I think a key takeaway from this whole deep dive is that this history is still being written. We're still learning about how colonialism and homosexuality intertwined and how that legacy continues to shape how we see sexuality, identity, and power today.
It feels like we've only just begun to explore this, and there's so much more to uncover.
Exactly. The most important thing is to approach this history with humility, recognizing the limitations of our sources, the complexities of the subject, and the importance of listening to different voices and perspectives.
Speaking of diverse voices, I'm wondering if we could shift our focus to the experiences of women within this historical intersection. So far, we've mainly talked about men, but I imagine the dynamics were quite different for women navigating colonialism and same-sex desire.
You're right. The experiences of women are often overlooked in this history. There's less documentation, but what we do have shows a fascinating and often difficult reality for women who dared to step outside those expected roles of wife and mother in a colonial context.
I'm really interested to hear more. What were some of the specific challenges they faced?
Well, one of the biggest challenges was the deeply patriarchal structure of both European societies and many colonized cultures. Women's lives were heavily controlled, their choices limited, and their sexuality often seen as a tool for men to control and for having children.
So expressing same-sex desire or being in same-sex relationships was seen as a threat to that patriarchal order.
Absolutely. It challenged the foundation of colonial power, which depended on those clear gender roles and controlling women's bodies and their ability to have children.
Makes sense. But surely some women defied those expectations. They found ways to express their desires and build relationships with other women, despite the risks.
They did, and their stories are crucial for understanding the diverse experiences within this historical intersection. The book has some fascinating examples of women forming close bonds, creating spaces of intimacy and support within the confines of colonial society.
Do you have any specific examples? I imagine those relationships could be anything from close friendships to romantic partnerships.
You're right, there was a whole range of relationships. For instance, there's a story about two British women who lived together in colonial India. They ran a successful business and shared a life together that defied what society expected of them.
Wow.
Their partnership really showed their resilience and how they created a meaningful life together despite the limitations of their time.
It's really inspiring to hear about women who found happiness and fulfillment despite the challenges they faced.
It is, and it reminds us that even in oppressive systems, people found ways to resist, to create their own spaces of freedom and connection.
It makes you wonder how those relationships were seen by others. Did they face social ostracism or legal repercussions for their choices?
The reactions varied. Sometimes these relationships were tolerated, maybe seen as harmless friendships, but in other cases, they were met with suspicion, condemnation, and even persecution. Remember, this was a time when women's lives were closely watched, and anything outside the norm could bring harsh judgment.
It's a reminder that even within colonialism, there were layers of oppression, with women facing unique challenges and discrimination.
Absolutely. Understanding those layers is key to getting a more complete and nuanced understanding of this history.
It's amazing how these personal stories can reveal so much about the larger social and cultural forces at play during this time.
It is, and I think one of the most valuable things about studying history is that it allows us to step outside our modern perspectives and consider the complexities of the past on its own terms.
It challenges us to question our assumptions and see the enduring power of human connection and resilience, even in the face of adversity.
Right.
It's really remarkable, even within such an oppressive system like colonialism, you still have these stories of resistance, of people pushing back and finding their own way.
Yeah, it's true.
As we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this complicated relationship between colonialism and homosexuality, is there any final thoughts, any reflections that really stand out to you? I mean, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface here, right? It's such a big topic.
You're right. It really is a history filled with, well, nuance, with contradictions, with so many different experiences. I think one thing we've seen is how important it is to move beyond those simple stories, the simple explanations.
Right.
We've seen how colonialism could create opportunities, but also dangers for people in same-sex relationships. We've talked about how it was shaped by and also shaped the existing cultural norms in those colonized societies. And we've looked at how it inspired art that both challenged and reinforced the power structures of the time.
It's almost like, I don't know, a kaleidoscope. You know?
Yeah.
Every time you turn it, there's a new pattern, a new layer to this relationship between colonialism and homosexuality.
I like that analogy. It's very fitting.
It makes you realize just how connected these seemingly separate historical forces really are.
Yeah, and that's what makes this history so fascinating to study, I think. It pushes us to think critically, to question what we think we know, and to see the humanity of the people who lived through this, this complex and often really difficult time.
Absolutely. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about real people, their choices, their struggles, their triumphs.
Mm-hmm.
And by understanding their stories, we get a better understanding of how the world we live in came to be.
Right. And as we're wrapping up here, I think it's really important to think about what this history can teach us about our own lives, our own time. We've seen how those colonial encounters often led to forcing European norms and values onto other cultures, sometimes even criminalizing homosexuality and reinforcing homophobic attitudes.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that the impact of colonialism didn't just disappear. It still affects LGBTQ plus people in many parts of the world today.
Definitely. We see it in discriminatory laws, social stigma, and those ongoing fights for equality and recognition. The fight for justice and inclusion is far from over. It's something that requires us to understand the historical roots of prejudice and discrimination.
But we've also seen those glimmers of hope, haven't we? We've seen individuals and communities pushing back against those legacies, reclaiming their own histories, and fighting for change.
Absolutely, and those stories of resistance are so powerful. They show us that history isn't set in stone. It's an ongoing conversation, a constant process of struggle and transformation. Those stories inspire us to keep working towards a world that's more just, more equitable, recognizing that our struggles for human rights and social justice are all connected.
It's amazing to see how those who were silenced are now finding their voices and demanding to be heard. Their courage is incredible.
It is, and their activism shows just how important it is to listen to different perspectives, to amplify those marginalized voices, to challenge systems of oppression wherever we find them.
So this deep dive, it's not just about looking back, it's about looking forward with a more critical and informed perspective, using what we've learned from the past to build a better future.
Exactly, and as we move forward, I think approaching this history with humility, with empathy, and a willingness to learn from the mistakes that were made is essential. It's about recognizing the harm that was done, celebrating the resilience of those who resisted, and working towards a future where everyone can live authentically and freely, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
What a powerful message to end on. This deep dive has been such a journey, uncovering these hidden stories, challenging our own thoughts, and making us think about the complexities of history and how it still affects us today.
It really has.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious, made you want to learn more, and made you want to engage with this really crucial part of our shared history.
I hope so.
Until next time.